We've got two speakers today. I'm delighted to introduce Sarah Moody and Karen Warwick, who'll be introducing us to the guidance and considering how you might be able to draw on the Bell Foundation's classroom guidance and strategies to support EAL learners in intervention sessions. Sarah joined the Bell Foundation as a trainer in 2021. She has many years of experience in a range of settings, including language schools, secondary schools, and a whole range more. She has an MA in Applied Linguistics, an ESOL-focused PGCE, and 2 postgraduate diplomas. She developed the Bell Foundation's classroom guidance and strategies last year and has written this new guidance to provide ideas around how those strategies might be used to support learners using EAL in intervention groups. And Karen joined the Bell Foundation in November 2020, having previously worked as an EAL specialist for local authorities and independently. And before that, she was a primary school teacher. Karen has an MA in education and a CELTA qualification. Her work with the Bell Foundation includes delivering online training, supporting with the development, including of this document, and also in the involvement of scaling of the Bell Foundation's EAL programme regionally. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Sarah now.
Okay, I'll just share my screen. Does that look good? I think it does. Okay, so welcome everybody to the launch of this guidance about guidance. They're using the Bell Foundation's classroom guidance with intervention groups. This is the map for today's session. We're going to start with the why produce guidance about guidance, move on to the what, as in defining what we mean by an intervention, and particularly an EAL intervention. Then look at some more key practicalities around them. Then we'll cover some kind of broad stroke do's and don'ts around the slightly controversial question of removing EAL learners from their classes. And then how to use the guidance which was published today in conjunction with the guidance that was published last year. And then finally, Karen's going to take you through some fictional but based on real life case studies to illustrates very importantly how all this might actually play out and look in practice in a secondary school. So the classroom guidance and strategies document, which I co-wrote with Caroline and which produced last year, it doesn't deal with out of class intervention specifically. And this was a deliberate decision because the Bell Foundation position is and remains that mainstreaming is best for reasons that I'll go into during this presentation. However, having said that, we know from our work with schools that interventions do happen, out-of-class interventions do happen for a variety of reasons, with the decisions always being taken in the best interest of the child. And we know that these interventions take a variety of forms. And also, this is a topic which we often get asked about. So we've written a guide to use with a guide. And that's what it looks like. Just fresh off the press today. You can download it and print it out if you haven't already. So the inclusion quadrant by Evans et al. Divides inclusion into 4 aspects which overlap and are interdependent. And it's become a kind of bedrock, really, of what we do at the Bell Foundation because we like it so much. So I thought I'd run the idea of interventions through this quadrant of inclusion and see what we get. So first of all, linguistic inclusion, the first quadrant, is about the learner feeling that they and their language are an important and respected part of the school. It's about them knowing that they don't have to leave their language at the school gate with their parents or turn it off in class with their phone. But it's also true that to be fully linguistically included, learners need, as well as being able to use their own language, they need proficiency in English because, you know, this is the language of the curriculum and exams in the UK. And so interventions can be geared to speeding up that language acquisition when it's needed. To work towards social inclusion, again, it's very important that learners access the mainstream as much as possible in order to build those very important mixed language friendship groups and feel as if they're part of the whole school community and not something separate that's tacked on to something not really designed for them. Having said that, intervention sessions can be a safe space to practice speaking. I remember when I went to live in another country where I didn't speak the language, how embarrassing it is when you try and say something and either you're not understood or you're laughed at. And intervention sessions can be a safe space for teenagers who are, let's face it, self-conscious enough already very often to practice those speaking and those social skills. And this can help in social interactions, although they obviously can't be a substitute for the real thing. But then we've got teachers' attitudes, and these obviously unpin the whole question of inclusion. And this is where it can be slightly problematic if intervention isn't handled properly, I think, because if a learner feels that a teacher or teachers don't want them in their classes because of their lack of English, if that's how the student feels, even if it's not how the school wants them to feel, then that sends a very negative message. And so the message that EAL learners and indeed their non-EAL peers receive around being removed from classes to attend interventions, this needs to be carefully managed if this is to be seen as inclusive. So I'm going to say repeatedly through the session that it's all about collaboration, and it's about the classroom teachers actually taking ownership of what happens when the EAL children are out of their classes. And then finally, to work towards full academic inclusion, obviously include them as much as possible in the mainstream, but with the appropriate support. And this means using those EAL-friendly strategies in your teaching, as well as judicious use of translation, etc. And if an out-of-class intervention is needed, as it sometimes is, it needs to be geared towards equipping the learner with the skills and the language they need to access the full mainstream curriculum as soon as possible. Okay, so we've looked at the 4 quadrants of the inclusion, and we found that interventions can, in fact, touch on all of them in different ways. So in order to use the classroom guidance and strategies most effectively to support your interventions, when you open the new guidance, first of all, you'll see a lovely shiny flowchart provided, which you can see on this screenshot. And it's quite simple, taking you through the process. First of all, what you have to do is read the introduction and the overview in order to familiarise yourself with the various intervention types that we've included. Then you'll want to decide which type of intervention you're offering, which type is going to be best for your context and your learner or learners. Read the section then on how to use the support strategies with your chosen intervention, and then look at the relevant case studies, which might give you some ideas and inspiration as to how this could look in practice. Okay, so that's how to use the guidance. So moving on, it's very important, I think, first of all, to be clear about exactly what we mean by an EAL intervention. So let's start by answering that key question. What is an EAL intervention? For the purpose of this guidance and this training, we've defined an EAL intervention as a focused teaching session which isn't part of normal mainstream practice. That's the intervention part. And the EAL part, it's designed to fill those gaps, to address the balance between what a learner knows and what they need to know in terms of participating fully in the mainstream, even with adaptation. So it's about redressing the balance between the English they have and the English they need. So interventions need to be on top of good whole school practice, the cherry on the cake, not the cherry sitting on its own on a plate. There's often no need to withdraw learners from class, but sometimes it is beneficial, especially at secondary level. However, interventions cannot and should not be a substitute for providing a language-rich environment, including wherever possible, seeing and hearing and being able to use the home language via translanguaging, via access to bilingual adults and peers, etc., as this is their best and sometimes only learning resource that they bring with them. Adaptations, the flashcards, the substitution tables, the reading, writing, speaking frames, etc., can be used within the class and shouldn't not be used because the child is also having interventions. They could be supported by a TA in a class, by working with peers in a class. And if further out-of-class interventions are used and are needed, they need to be on top of, not instead of these things. And then not forgetting that links with home are also really important. Sometimes forgotten at secondary, I think, but equally important, as the parents can play a really key role in both maintaining the first language and developing curriculum learning. So this next section seeks to answer some key questions. So which learners would benefit? At secondary school, the curriculum moves fast, I think everyone would agree, and the teaching's delivered by multiple subject specialists, requiring the learners to understand all those different voices and accents and teaching styles and mannerisms, as well as follow a timetable, which is full of codes and abbreviations and acronyms, and move around the school. And it can be really confusing for new arrivals, especially if they haven't had much schooling before, if they've had very different schooling before, or if they're still in the earlier stages of acquiring English. So we're going to say that learners, particularly those at bands A and B at key stages 3 and 4, might benefit from out-of-class interventions if they've got difficulty accessing the curriculum, their needs can't be met by just by the in-class strategies that we mentioned before, if they've been assessed and the EAL specialists agree that this is the best thing to do, and crucially, if the parents agree and the parents understand the implications of what they would be missing. And as well as parents, I'd say the learner themselves needs to be consulted and needs to agree that this is a good way to go. At key stage 4, and only at key stage 4, learners at higher proficiency bands, C and even the beginning of D, might also sometimes benefit from interventions if they have a reduced options timetable to allow them to focus on passing some exams rather than taking a whole load of exams and not passing any. Then they might spend some option slots focusing on English language support to help them achieve success in the exams that they're taking. So this could be, for example, extra tuition in science or maths, but focused on the language skills they need to understand the questions in the exam and to write what I used to call, when I was a teacher, those mark magnet answers in the exam. Some schools run extra qualifications as well, such as the IGCSE in English as a second language or the Trinity ESOL exams. We're not going to go into those here, but they might also be seen as interventions. They might also use this time to look to the future and build up their links with 16+ providers. And I've seen some examples of where teachers and educators from the college have come into school to work with key stage 4 learners. That might be another intervention that could take place. And again, it's important that both learners and their parents agree to have these interventions take place and are aware of the implications of what doors are opening and what doors are closing. Okay, so what are EAL interventions for? Very crucial question. The obvious answer, they're there to address the gap, to bridge the gap between the English a learner needs and what they currently have. Of course, EAL learners have this double job to do. They have to learn English and they have to learn curriculum content at the same time and interdependently. So it can be handy to think of a seesaw, which needs to be balanced. And we came up with this little diagram where you've got the proficiency in English developments represented by orange, balancing the curriculum content acquisition, which has to come with some English development as well. So interventions will vary, of course, depending on the individual need of the learner. And it's possible that a learner might receive some interventions out of the mainstream to redress the balance and close the following gaps. To learn to read and write using the Roman script, if this is new or unfamiliar to them, perhaps because of lack of previous schooling or disrupted previous schooling, or coming from a very rural area in a country where they don't use the Roman script. Less often at secondary, but still used, phonics interventions for reading. To learn some survival English for the classroom and the playgrounds, and to learn some subject-specific English vocabulary and structures to help them in their mainstream lessons. Which staff should be involved? Well, schools vary in their staffing of interventions, depending on their expertise, the availability, increasingly the school budget and the need. And as the aim of interventions is to address the balance, staff responsible for both areas, the mainstream and the EAL intervention, need to collaborate closely. And I know this can be time consuming, well aware of that, but it really needs to happen. Time needs to be ring fenced for this collaboration to happen, or there's a risk of the left hand not knowing what the right hand is doing. So the teacher delivering the class from which the learner is absent, having an intervention, doesn't actually know what that learner who's out of her class is doing in her intervention. And the teacher or staff member delivering the intervention doesn't know what their learner is missing. And therefore, the learner's not getting joined up provision. So those meetings, that collaboration is absolutely essential. Having said that, EAL interventions can be and are successfully delivered by suitably trained HLTAs, teachers, SENCOs, as well as, of course, EAL specialists and EAL leads. And there are also increasingly some excellent tutoring organisations used by schools to deliver interventions. And again, even though this might be more difficult because it's another organisation, collaboration and communication remain the keys. So let's look at when they should start and when they should finish. They should start as soon as possible after a need is identified, and in a nutshell, finish as soon as it's possible for the learner to be accommodated successfully in the class through suitable adaptations. And as always, one size never fits all. So we suggest setting a time limit initially, but then reviewing it regularly so that it's both fixed and flexible, if that makes sense. Okay, so those were some key questions. Going to move on now to look at some overarching do's and don'ts of interventions. And this is quite tricky because I'm well aware that there's a wide range of contexts out there, probably a wide range of contexts watching this, but these are some overarching do's and don'ts of interventions in secondary schools, really in the UK. So I prefer should and shouldn't to do and don't. But first of all, I think I've already said it, they should be time limited and they should be reviewed regularly. Different learners have different needs and they respond differently to both interventions and to being in whole class situations. The aim should always be to minimise the time spent out of lessons. So to this end, as I said, you set an initial time limit and then you review it and you include the students and the parents in the reviews. And that way you achieve a kind of bespoke provision, which is exactly the right length for the learner. So another should, all EAL learners should, could say must really, be closely linked to the curriculum. As the aim is for the learner to rejoin his or her peers full-time as soon as possible, it's important to focus on the vocabulary and the structures which will help them to do exactly that. And the best way of achieving this is for the EAL specialist to work alongside the curriculum specialist to produce suitable materials. And there's an example here from one of the Bell Foundation resources, which is aimed at science, a science lesson. And they should also aim to remove learners from as little curriculum time as possible, because it's in the class taught by the subject specialists that the most effective learning will occur. Another should, EAL learners should be grouped, by year group rather than by a sort of perceived language level, because this allows you to concentrate on the relevant subject material for that year group. So although it might be tempting to put EAL learners from different year groups who are roughly at the same language level in one group, in fact, it's easier, maybe not easier for the teacher, but it's easier to achieve that aim of linking it to the curriculum content if you group the learners together by year group. And if that means you have learners at slightly different language levels in your group, that's no more differentiation than a class teacher has to do every day. It should be perfectly achievable, and it will enable you to link the curriculum material much more closely. Another thing it should do, this may be the last should, I think, is it should be distinct from send interventions unless you happen to know that a learner with EAL has a given send. And there's some good guidance, fairly recently produced guidance from the Bell Foundation on send and EAL. We'll put the link for that in the chat. You might find it interesting to look at that alongside this. Okay, we're moving on to the shouldn'ts. Those were some do's, but bearing in mind again that no size ever fits all, and I'm aware of the range of contexts, here are some very general don'ts or shouldn'ts. So firstly, there are lots and lots of EFL type English language textbooks and programs available, but we don't recommend them, certainly not for sole use. The main reason for this is that they're designed for a different client group. They're designed for learners of English as a foreign language rather than as an additional language, and this is where that difference really matters. And again, it's all about that double job. Your EAL learners are trying to do two things at once, whereas these textbooks are aimed purely at learning the English language. So although these books and schemes are often really attractive, they're really shiny and attractively presented, they're written by experts, it's a multi-million, I don't know, multi-million, but certainly $1 million business, the ELT worldwide business. And so there are some nice products out there, although they're not cheap, but they're not specifically linked to the language that the learner needs to access the school curriculum. And so we wouldn't recommend using them exclusively. That's not to say that you can't jump into them, dip in and out of them here and there. So grammar exercises like the one shown on the screen, they might sometimes be appropriate to quickly dip in to explain or clarify something, and they certainly can be appropriate for home or self-study, particularly at Key Stage 4, if it's felt a learner needs clarification on a particular aspect of grammar. But generally this stuff is much better taught in context as it arises. So to sum up, we don't recommend EFL, English as a Foreign Language schemes, because using this kind of scheme risks not teaching the language the learners most need. It risks spending valuable time when they could be in class on unnecessary content, and therefore not closing the gap between the English they know and the English they require for school in the most efficient way. We also don't recommend removing learners from their classes for all or most of the school day. And this is because it risks hindering social inclusion and preventing the learner from feeling a part of the classroom community and developing those mixed language friendship groups, which will help them settle in and help them learn English. More important curriculum content is missed, and it'll be hard for them to catch up on this because they've missed it, and they've got to catch up on it without having, a full level of English. And so this results counterproductively often in actually widening the gap between what the learner knows and needs to know. So all that effort actually can make things worse. So let's quickly then look at examples of how the interventions document helps you to use the strategies document. The classroom guidance and support strategies document is aimed at supporting learners using EAL within the mainstream. As I said, that's where the vast majority of learning takes place. However, whilst very definitely not a scheme of work in itself, it can also inform the planning of out-of-class interventions. So it's starting with some big picture questions, which are in the beginning of the strategies and which we should consider now. So you've decided you want to do an intervention. It's the best thing for your learner. How do you go about it with reference to the classroom guidance and strategies? First of all, it's organised by proficiency bands, bands A to E. So you need to know which proficiency band your learner's in. And it's also organised by target skills, speaking and reading and viewing and writing and listening and understanding. So look at the strategies and suggestions for activities within your learner's band, within the skills that you're most wanting to focus on. It can also be useful to scan the adjacent bands, as learners rarely fit neatly into all descriptors, and to scan the other target skills, as most learners need a bit of help with all of them. But I think it's true that some learners coming from some countries have already learnt quite high levels of reading and writing, in English, and that isn't the problem, but they're completely banjaks when it comes to speaking. They're really finding it difficult to break through this wall of sound and to listen effectively and break down what they hear into things that make sense. And we also get students who are socially very fluent, who've learnt maybe out of school in the area where they live, or maybe in a previous school they've learnt quite fluent social internet English, if you like, but don't know when it's appropriate to use this word or that word, and really aren't very good at reading or writing. So I think it's good to look at the target skills and decide where you want to focus it. Then moving on, we need to look at the Bell Foundation's 5 key principles for good EAL practice. And I think we're going to put the link to this in the chat as well. These underpin everything that we recommend. They are the foundations of good EAL pedagogy, so it's no surprise that they're mentioned here too. These are evidence-based principles, and they should guide all EAL methodology, both inside and outside of the classroom. In the Classroom Guidance and Support Strategies document, you'll find ideas and suggestions organised by and which align with these principles. So we'll just quickly go over them now. How will your proposed interventions align? So the principles are multilingualism as an asset. How are you getting this message across and making use of the learner's most valuable resource, which is, of course, their language? This should be part of the whole school ethos, of course, but what will you do in interventions? So examples could be explicitly teaching and practicing note-taking, using the first language, using translators, etc. No good providing a nice shiny app if they don't know how to use it. Skills that the learners can carry with them into their classes. Then we have high expectations with appropriate support. The interventions can form part of the appropriate support, but they should never let the expectations slip. Ultimately, it should be quite clear that yes, they will move into mainstream and learn alongside their peers. They will take exams in English. Yes, it's not easy for them, but it can be done. And this support, both in and outside of the classroom, is to enable them to succeed. Always link what you're doing to how it will help. And then an integrated focus on content and language. Talked about this quite a lot already. It's that double job again. They need to know the curriculum subject content and the ways to express it in English. And again, always make this link so they know why you're teaching what you're teaching. If you're covering past tenses, for example, in an English language intervention, how are these currently being used? Maybe in RE or in history. Can you find examples of them used in maths problems? How might they be used in social chats with their friends? Effective and holistic assessment. How can your interventions form part of this? Can you use them to gather info and evidence to track their English language acquisition progress? I would argue that you might well be able to get some quite useful examples to contribute to their assessment in an intervention situation. And then finally, social inclusion, last but not at all least. If they're out of class for some of the time, how will you facilitate the social inclusion? We mentioned earlier providing a safe space for talking. You can have practice conversations. You can maybe use some of the interventions to talk about hobbies and interests and then signpost suitable clubs. There are various ways, if you're creative, that you can include social inclusion elements in your interventions. So I'm conscious of time. The types of interventions which are covered in this guidance are listed here. This is a screenshot from the guidance. So we have orientation or induction interventions, which are common at many schools. We have buddies, peer mentoring, young interpreters type interventions, which are common at many schools as well. We have the pre-teaching type intervention, which I'll talk about more in a minute. Then, as I said, phonics or reading type interventions, less common at secondary school, but still happen. English language sessions focus on that. And then, of course, family or parent-focused interventions, which sometimes forgotten about at secondary school, but I think, in fact, are really important. So firstly, looking at induction or orientation type interventions. In secondary schools, these can run at both Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4 with new arrivals. So they run as soon as the learner starts at the school. and they're strictly time limited. They might even be one-offs. And they might include things like finding your way around the school. If the child hasn't been part of a great big school before, it can be very daunting. Reading a timetable. I think I mentioned earlier, a timetable can be really confusing, full of initials and acronyms and room numbers to these, echoing corridors that you can't find your way around. Can be really useful just to take an hour for somebody to practice with you, finding your way from one room to another. Young interpreters could be involved here. How to use translation software. It's no use if you don't know how to use it. And then ICT tuition I've put because many learners, particularly those seeking asylum who haven't had much education before or have been in quite rudimentary makeshift sort of education situations sometimes, haven't had the ICT tuition that the children here have had. And so they can be a little bit flummoxed by it, usually very keen on it, but it can take some time before they start to be able to use it much better than we can. And then with induction and orientation interventions, they can be used to rehearse key classroom routines, familiarise new arrivals with school expectations around things like behaviour, introductions to extracurricular provisions and activities in which the learner has an interest as well, like sport and art or music clubs, and they could help facilitate social inclusion like this. They can be an important part of induction. So in the guidance, you have things like providing picture dictionaries to help with vocabulary development. You have things like exploring how best to use technology, depending on the learner's proficiency. You've got things about praise and encouragement, making sure the learner has sympathetic and welcoming buddies with whom to spend breaks. All of those might make part of your induction or orientation interventions and be bits of the guidance that you might want to read. So moving on, buddies and peer mentoring. Peers are in the unique position, really, of being able to offer support both socially and in class in a way that adults can't. So schemes like the award-winning Young Interpreters from Hampshire are highly effective in helping international new arrivals overcome some of the language and social barriers at school, especially if buddies share a language with the new arrival. They can play a really big role in assimilating the learner into lessons by using the shared language in English. And they can also be there at break and lunch times, which is one of the times when learners used to report to me that they've sometimes felt the loneliest. They can also be a gateway to various clubs and activities based on shared interests, and this can be a really good way of building mixed language friendship groups. So it's important, if you can, to choose buddies where it looks like there is a potential shared interest. And they can interpret and model good language and good behaviour. It's also important that they receive training for and recognition for their role, but that's probably a topic for another training. Okay, so from the guidance, you can find references which are applicable to buddying, such as in class, group the child with friendly near-peer mentors or buddies, preferably including other speakers of their preferred language, such as exploring how best to use technology, depending on the learner's proficiency. Can buddies use an app to communicate? Do they have a shared interest in some aspect of technology, for example? I remember one school where there was a very, very popular lunchtime computer games club in the library, and it had to be rationed with tickets because it was so popular. And the librarian decided to give priority to EAL new arrivals and their buddies on certain days. And that shot up the interest in being a buddy. And then making sure that the learner has sympathetic and welcoming buddies with whom to spend breaks and lunch. That's mentioned in the guidance as well. Moving on to pre-teaching sessions. These are a popular and useful form of targeted EAL intervention, and they involve preparing learners for very specific content and its associated vocabulary and structures in upcoming classes, or sometimes in upcoming modules. You might run some pre-teaching sessions before you start a new science module, on materials, for example. These can take place before school, at the very start of a lesson, although I think that's easier in primary than secondary, or at the end of school as well. They don't have to be out of class, but their targeted nature makes them really, really effective in enabling learners to better access the mainstream. The learner becomes familiar with the concepts being covered and has the chance as well to link it to and transfer knowledge which they might already have in their first language. So pre-teaching sessions, recommend them very highly. And from the guidance, you've got quite a few things that might be used in this type of intervention, including creating visual word maps specific to topics. By introducing a visual word map, the intervention teacher can show the new arrival what to expect in an upcoming lesson, rehearse some of the key words and phrases. The learner can then take this resource with them into the lesson and listen out for the key words. And the teacher of the mainstream lesson, if they've been in collaboration with the intervention teacher, can know which words have been covered and can make sure that they target the learner for some key questions in which they can succeed. They can also be providers, the learner that is, with a listening chart, a kind of listening frame, where they list topic-specific phrases to listen out for in the lesson and tick off during teacher-led content. And this can help to break down, especially for Band A students, that wall of sound, which is how language first presents itself when it's a language you don't know, can help to break it down by listening out for specific words and phrases. Then a really important one, finding out from the learner what they're finding most challenging. We're talking, secondary school teenagers here. They're grown up enough to be able to tell you, often quite articulately, and then using this info to inform future sessions and again to feed back to the subject teachers in your collaboration session so the subject teacher can go over those things again. And then rehearsal, we've said it before, allowing the learner to rehearse speaking the new words, get their tongue around those new words before they're required to do so in class. So these sessions are preparation for upcoming classes or module, and everything in them is geared towards those, and that's why we recommend them. Some pupils at the secondary level haven't mastered reading and writing in the Roman script, usually due to disrupted previous education. And before deciding if extra intervention is necessary here, I would say give them a bit of time so they can hear how the English phonics system sounds and works and see if they can actually begin to work it out themselves. But if they require extra tuition in phonics and or handwriting, they can often join an existing catch-up intervention. These need to be age appropriate. For example, Fresh Start is one that I know is used. However, care needs to be taken that the child with EAL understands the meaning of what they're learning to decode. Sometimes there's an assumption that everybody knows what the meaning of, the word fox is, for example. They might not. If a learner is not familiar with writing the Roman script, they might need some intervention for that, perhaps with some handwriting practice, I would say, at home. Model handwriting for the learner, like on a mini whiteboard, and make sure teachers know in your collaboration sessions, make sure that the class teachers know to allow extra time in class to complete the written work and that they know what level of written work to expect. So strategies from the guidance which might help here. Most secondary schools will already have their age-appropriate phonics up and running, so it's a case of adapting these slightly to include EAL learners. Using translation tools can help the learners who are literate in their first language spot and recognise how patterns differ between the two languages. And it can be worth sometimes stopping the class and having conversation to explore this, because this is really interesting stuff, fostering an interest in languages. And then matching activities like bingo will help make the links between sounds and letters meaningful, especially for beginners. And then things like labelling activities are useful for practicing meaningful writing in context, much less intimidating than being asked to write handed a blank page and asked to write an essay. Moving on, lots of schools run English language intervention sessions aimed at EAL learners. Sessions should be planned to familiarise learners with the key vocab and grammatical structures which are relevant to the curriculum lessons for their year group. They can also provide a safe space to develop confidence in speaking and presentation skills. Presentations might be something they've never done before in English. And pupils can be familiarised with the types of activities that they might encounter in class, such as think, pair, share, or brainstorming, or working in pairs, or working collaboratively. These might be strategies that haven't been used in schools they've been to previously. Also, everyday classroom protocols such as hand raising and answering questions can be modelled or explicitly taught and practiced. As we said before, we don't recommend the sole use of decontextualised language courses. Everything should be linked to the curriculum. Also, in order to minimise withdrawal from mainstream, you might consider running classes like this, particularly for older pupils, after school. So from the guidance, you've got things like providing opportunities to get your tongue around new words and sounds in a safe space, which is a key advantage of small group interventions. You've got things like matching and labelling. You've got things like labelling a diagram of a plant cell or choosing from a list of words, matching flashcards, words and pictures of a history topic, for example, and then the sorting and sequencing, like sequencing scenes from a Shakespeare play or sequencing stages of an experiment or the water cycle, endless uses for sequencing for the secondary curriculum, and things like gap fills and scaffolding writing tasks, writing frames to aid writing. It's important again to say that the activities used in the intervention should be similar to the adaptive strategies that are used by various teachers in class. So the intervention then has the function also of preparing the child to go into class, so that when in class, the learner is given a substitution table by the teacher, they know how to use it because they practiced it in intervention. Okay, and last of these is the parent-orientated interventions, because fostering a strong and mutually respectful relationship between parents and schools will really benefit the parents, the schools, and the learners. In the case of the parents of newly arrived children, there may be additional considerations, and they include the parents' own levels of proficiency in English, their familiarity with the UK system, and their expectations and aspirations around school, and sometimes also feelings of marginalisation, particularly in quite hostile anti-immigrant communities that we have today in places. So parent-orientated interventions can help to address all of these, and they might take the form of things like coffee mornings, curriculum mornings or evenings where curriculum is explained with interpreters, linking with parent governors, linking with community reps, etc. And there's some useful translated guidance for parents on the Bell Foundation website, which you might want to look at. It's in 20-something languages. I forget exactly how many. There's guidance on welcoming parents and carers throughout the document. A few examples include signposting supplementary schools, also things like ESOL classes and community groups in the area, encouraging families to attend. Assuaging parents' feeling of inadequacy sometimes that they sometimes have. I'd like to help my child, but I can't because I don't know enough English, by emphasising, taking every opportunity to emphasise that the curriculum is equally valid in any language, and encouraging discussion of curriculum content at home. So if you have a teenager and they come home and you say, what did you learn today? And they'll say, you know, plant and animal cells, then you can have a conversation about that in your home language, or you can ask to look at the textbook or the worksheets that they're doing, and you can discuss them in your home language. An interpreter for meetings is a really good investment, and they might be in a position to find out any concerns which you can then feed back into your future provision. And then invite parents, carers into school as experts to lead discussion groups, or to talk about their work, or to showcase some of their skills, whether that's their language skills or cooking skills or craft skills or sports skills. They come with a big variety of skills. Okay, so that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour of how the guidance works. At this point, I'm going to stop sharing and pass over to Karen to consider case studies. There are 4 case studies in the new guidance, but we've just picked 2 to focus on here.
Thanks, Sarah. So I'm just going to share my screen. Bear with me 2 seconds. There we are. Okay, so I'm just going to do a short short tour through a couple of case studies. So in the guidance, there are 4 case studies for the secondary guidance, but for the purpose of this webinar and time, we're just going to look at 2. So, and the first young person you'll meet is Lucas. He's in year 7. And his background, well, Lucas starts in year 7. He arrived in his primary school in year 4. And this is what we know about him. He arrived in year 4. He's had disrupted schooling. He's from Slovak and he's speaks Romanian. He's socially really confident and he's got considerable confidence and fluency in his social situation with his peers. And at the moment, he's presenting for speaking and listening to the staff in his new secondary school at band C and D in English for speaking and listening. However, his literacy, his reading and writing skills are underdeveloped, as is his just general academic vocabulary. And it's thought that his proficiency in this at this moment is around a band A and B. And I suspect a gap in his language skills will be connected to a lot of previous disrupted schooling as well. So it's really important that this information is really known, as I'm sure you will know, and you know this. And what's also apparent is that this seems to match his skills in his home language as well. So he's got underdeveloped English literacy skills, as well as his reading and writing proficiency in his home languages, which is very poor. Again, linked to limited schooling and disrupted schooling prior to coming to the UK. But what's really, really important as well, and I think Sarah's picked up on this as we've gone through the as she's gone through her guidance, is he has really supportive parents and they want him to do well, and they want him to do well in life. So this is an important bit of information to know about. So thinking a bit further about Lucas, I'm sure this is a familiar scene in schools for you. We've suggested 4 sort of interventions from the guidance that could help him. So Sarah's made much of induction as she's gone along in her delivery there. It's important. Targeted language support, slightly different, and to targeted literacy support. And of course, that all important social inclusion, again, that has been picked up as a bit of a thread throughout this webinar. So let's have a little think, first of all, about the induction process for Lucas. Okay, so he would have hopefully been really involved in that year 6, year 7 transition. And of course, we really hope that his family have been really involved in understanding the transition process as well, from year 6 to year 7. And involved in that would be for his home, again, that, I've just said that communication with home, and that includes some of the things Sarah's already picked up on, providing accessible materials so that parents understand what's going on. Having opportunities to invite parents to the school, making sure they know about events. If you have parent or parent ambassadors for learners for the EAL community in their schools, that they're aware of the parents know about them, and can help to support the welcoming process. And to stress really that, parents, like all parents, play a very crucial part in their children's education, through taking, knowing about his work, talking about his work, and helping him to develop his home language, that academic language. They are your biggest language resource, as well as the learner is the parent. There's also young interpreters. Sarah spoke a lot about them already, and they can be accessed through the Hampshire MTAS site. It's a very, very good programme if you have not already been involved in it. Because they create language buddies for new learners and new arrivals. And of course, as part of his induction, it's really useful to have someone that Lucas can knows is his kind of anchor, and who he can check in with on a daily basis, or as and when he wants to. That could include setting up either a weekly meeting or a meeting every couple of days at the end of the day. You know, they're there to troubleshoot. That could be an EAL specialist, it could be a TA, it could be a class teacher, a subject teacher, but they're a very useful anchor for Lucas to know about. So moving on to targeted language support. So in terms of the guidance, what could the EAL specialist do, or even the subject teacher? Well, they could look at the guidance, for starters, and find the speaking and listening section for bands C and D, because we know that Lucas has got good social fluency, and I think, you know, it's that high expectation to develop that rather than go to the lower stages of proficiency, to keep that expectation going and go to the higher proficiencies. And she decides that, or they decide that, what Lucas would really benefit from is pre-teaching. Sarah's spoken a lot about pre-teaching here, so I'm just really paralleling this case study alongside what Sarah's said. So I'm not going into pre-teaching in particular, but needless to say, it'll help with up and coming areas of the curriculum to help build the gap in his subject specific vocabulary, give him that confidence to be able to go to class with the right vocabulary that he needs to use. And there's just a little highlight there of areas that you can look for in the guidance. Also important would be to look at beneficial to clarify register. So looking at idiomatic language that arises that could be difficult for Lucas, and there's plenty of suggestions in the guidance there to show you. And also to find that difference between you know, formal language and informal language, and that Lucas knows where to use it, because we know he's very socially confident, and with that comes sometimes inappropriate use of language as well, particularly in written language, so that they're using the right register appropriately. So that's the first thing that would help Lucas as an intervention type. And obviously keep going with your check-ins. You know, a good idea would be to, for whoever the anchor person is, to check what new language Lucas has come across through the day, help him locate it, and he has that opportunity to perhaps, you know, address that as homework as well. But it's also important for that check-in person to check in with the subject teachers, so that everybody is collaborating and everybody is communicating with each other, so that Lucas can get the best out of his education. Again, a thread that Sarah has brought up in the webinar. Okay, so then the next thing that would really help Lucas is the targeted literacy support. We know that he's come from primary school with low literacy levels, and there's a bit of a history going back there linked to school disruption. And a good place to start, obviously, would be in Band A and Band B for reading and writing, reading and viewing and writing in Band A and Band B. Band B being early acquisition and emerging English as an additional language. And these are the icons that you see in the guidance when you're looking for that. So the EAL specialist thinks about phonics catch-up. Sarah's mentioned Fresh Start as a program. It has to be age appropriate, because he'll have come with phonics, but there may be some difficulties, you know, with vowels and spelling and those kind of decoding skills. So it's really, you need to know what it is and what it is you're trying to do in your intervention. And then obviously there's reading support that could occur, and there are many opportunities. We've got many examples on our resource website around, and in our great ideas around activities using darts, which is related. Darts is directed activities related to text. There's many ideas there: close exercises, gap fill, sentence stems, substitution tables with pictures. Anything that's written down will build up reading. So you know, they're good to explore and try out in your intervention. And then we have that continuing check-in. And the next case study, very aware that we've got 3 minutes left, is Kasia, who's from year 8. Now, Kasia has come from Poland, and she joined secondary school at the beginning of year 8 in about October. And this is what we know from our profiling and gathering information from her parent, is that, as I said, she's Polish. She's above average in her ability, but she's very anxious and she's very shy. And she loves maths and she's really good at coding. So we know quite a lot about her. And according to her mum, she has, until she arrived in the UK, has had a full education in Poland. She has a lot of transferable skills that can be tapped into. So it's really, you have to be really careful about what intervention you think that Kasia would need. So let's briefly have a look at that. So again, looking at the guidance, it's really important, because she's anxious and she's shy and feeling really overwhelmed. She'll have had English lessons very likely in Poland, but it's a very different learning English as a foreign language to suddenly being immersed in the language in the country, which dialect might be different, the way it's used might be different. So it might be handy for Kasia to just have some gentle, you know, well thought through initial half-day inductions for a short period of time, maybe either a few weeks or until you feel that her confidence and she's, you know, happy with her school day. It also provides an anchor for her for checking in, and also gives that opportunity to get used to the timetable. You know, there may be very different organizational schedules going on that Kasia is not used to. I think any of us would feel worried starting in a new school with a new language in a new country. I'm not going to, young interpreters has been brought up, and some short-term language support. If we think back to the fact that we know quite a lot about this young lady, it's good to know through assessment what she can transfer, what she can translate herself, what she can do to make that, to bridge that gap. So let's just briefly look at that short-term language support as an intervention. So as I said, she studied English in Poland, but because she's very overwhelmed by the reality of speaking English, she may feel, I know that, but I don't know it. I know that word, but I can't express it. And feeling nervous about saying it correctly as well. Or is she thinking the right word that people wanted to recall? So it's considered carefully, and some short-term withdrawal groups would help at this point for Kasia, which might just run, say, 1 period a day, every one, maybe the first period or whatever period is appropriate, every day for the first few weeks until Kasia settles, and to be reviewed very, very frequently. And these sessions can focus on pre-teaching, again, relating the content to her prior knowledge. What does she know? What has she brought with her? What knowledge has she brought? Subject knowledge does she already have? She may have a very high standard, and we already know she has a very high standard in maths. That can be tapped into. It's more about transferring the skill. So we're going to go to Band C of the guidance and the strategies for high expectations and for effective holistic assessment, and we're going to think about social inclusion as well. And again, many suggestions, many Sarah has already mentioned in her delivery so far. And I think it's 5 minutes, so it's a minute past 5, Caroline. So most of what I was going to say here now has already been covered, but it's induction, assessment, and buddies has all been covered. So Caroline, do you want to jump in now and do your bit?
Thanks so much. I'm really, really conscious of time. There's been some really interesting comments. It's clearly a very, very difficult area for schools. I think especially at secondary. Sarah and I both secondary background, so we really appreciate the challenges facing you. There's also been some great suggestions made around working with parents and using opportunities after school, and keeping learning curriculum related and adapting programs that are already being used so that they will work for learners who use English as an additional language. So really quickly, just to let you know about courses that are coming up, we've got embedding, EAL assessment and adaptive teaching coming up. The programme of courses for next year will be launched soon. Karen, if you can keep clicking on.
Yeah, thank you.
And again. And then we've got just a reminder as well that you might find the ECT modules useful at this point. Just a reminder that they're also freely available, so that the QR code there is there, but they are obviously available directly from the website. You can find the link quite easily there. And then webinars coming up. We've got, if you know anybody, any primary schools, we've got the primary equivalent of this webinar is next week. We've also, very excitingly, we're launching our assessment MOOC next week. So the launch webinar for that is next week as well. It's really, really exciting. And then for the science teachers in your schools, we've got a webinar on the 5th of June that we're doing with ASE, looking at how to include EAL learners in science lessons. So absolutely really delighted to be working with ASE on that. And I think that must be everything. So a huge thank you to everybody for attending and for contributing. And we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.